Stay invisible tonight, my wife said, her voice light, almost playful, like she was giving me a harmless suggestion instead of erasing me from the room, and I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood something she didn't, something no one in that ballroom understood, that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one nobody sees. The chandeliers above us spilled gold across polished marble floors. Champagne glasses clinked in soft celebration, and the kind of laughter that only exists in rooms filled with money floated through the air like perfume, but none of it touched me, not really, because I had already stepped outside of it, already positioned myself exactly where she told me to be, invisible, forgotten, dismissed. Olivia looked perfect that night, emerald dress catching every flicker of light, her smile sharp and effortless as she moved between executives and partners, her hand occasionally brushing the arm of a man whose name I already knew long before he introduced himself to her, long before he laughed a little too comfortably at her jokes, and I watched it all without reacting, without stepping in, because reacting would have ruined the plan, and I had no intention of ruining anything. People glanced at me the way you glance at furniture, something present but irrelevant, a background detail that didn't require attention, and I let them. I let every assumption settle into place, let every quiet judgment build the story they wanted to believe, because stories like that are useful when you know how to end them. I took a slow sip of whiskey, the burn grounding, steady, familiar, and listened as someone near me whispered, "That's her husband, right?" Followed by a soft chuckle and a response I'd heard before in different forms. "Yeah, I think so." Like even certainty about me was optional, like my existence needed confirmation, and that was fine, more than fine, it was necessary. There's a moment, if you pay attention, when a room reveals its truth, not in the speeches or the smiles, but in the spaces between, in the way people look past you instead of at you, in the way your name disappears from conversations you used to be part of, and standing there, I realized this wasn't the first time Olivia had made me invisible, it was just the first time she'd said it out loud. I remember when things were different, when she used to look at me like I was the center of the room instead of an afterthought. But that memory didn't sting the way it should have, not anymore, because somewhere along the way I stopped needing to be seen by her to know exactly who I was. "You're being too quiet," she said when she passed by me, her voice low, controlled, not unkind but not warm either, just efficient, like she was managing optics, and I gave her a small smile, the kind that reassures without inviting questions, the kind that says everything is under control even when no one realizes what control actually means. I didn't follow her when she walked away, didn't insert myself into her conversations, didn't challenge the narrative unfolding around me. Because the truth is, invisibility isn't weakness when you choose it, it's leverage, and leverage works best when no one knows you have it. Across the room, a man in a tailored navy suit glanced in my direction, held my gaze for half a second longer than anyone else had all night, and then looked away, subtle, deliberate, like an acknowledgement that didn't belong in this version of the story, and I almost smiled, because that was the first crack. The smallest sign that the surface wasn't as solid as everyone believed. I adjusted my cuff, slow, deliberate, feeling the weight of time more than the fabric, remembering conversations that never happened in rooms like this, decisions made far from chandeliers and champagne, choices that shaped everything standing in front of me now, and I thought about how easy it is to confuse silence with absence, how quickly people assume that if you're not speaking, you have nothing to say. Olivia laughed again, louder this time, her voice cutting clean through the room. And for a moment, every eye turned toward her, drawn by confidence, by presence, by the illusion of control, and I stayed exactly where I was, exactly where she told me to be, because tonight wasn't about correcting her, it wasn't about proving anything in that moment, it was about letting the story play out to its natural conclusion, letting every person in that room believe what they wanted to believe until belief itself became the thing that broke them. I set my glass down gently, the sound barely audible against the hum of conversation, and looked around one last time, taking it all in, the lights, the laughter, the certainty in their faces, and I thought, not for the first time that night. I didn't disappear, I repositioned, and the difference between those two things is what was about to change everything. I learned a long time ago that people do not reveal themselves when they are comfortable, they reveal themselves when they think no one is watching, and that night, surrounded by soft music and polite laughter, Olivia believed she was completely unobserved, completely untouchable, and that belief made her careless in ways she never used to be. She moved through the room like she owned it, greeting senior partners by first name, leaning in just enough to seem warm but not enough to lose control. And every time someone complimented her, she accepted it like it was expected, like she had earned every inch of that attention on her own, and I did not interrupt that illusion, not even when I heard her say, "It is easier when you do not have extra weight holding you back," followed by a small laugh that drew a few knowing smiles from the circle around her. No one asked who she meant, but they did not have to, because in rooms like this, implication is louder than accusation, and I could feel a few glances drift toward me before quickly sliding away, as if acknowledging me for too long might make them part of something uncomfortable. I kept my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, because reacting would have changed the dynamic, and the dynamic was exactly where I needed it to be, balanced on a false assumption that was about to collapse under its own weight. A waiter passed by and paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to ask quietly, "Another drink, sir?" with a level of respect that did not match the way the rest of the room treated me, and I gave a slight nod, noticing the way he held eye contact a moment longer than expected before moving on, and that was the second crack, small but precise, a detail that would not register to anyone else but confirmed that the surface narrative was not as complete as it seemed. I remember when Olivia used to ask me questions that mattered, questions about direction, about decisions, about what came next, but somewhere along the way, those questions turned into statements, then into assumptions, and finally into dismissals, and I let that progression happen without resistance, not because I did not notice, but because timing matters more than reaction, and there is a difference between losing control and choosing when to take it back. Across the room, the man in the navy suit I had noticed earlier was now speaking to one of the board members, his tone measured, his posture controlled, and when their conversation ended, he glanced toward me again, subtle, almost invisible, like a signal that was not meant for anyone else, and I understood it for exactly what it was, a quiet acknowledgement that everything was proceeding as expected. Olivia's voice rose again, brighter now, more animated, and I caught fragments of her conversation as I moved slightly closer without drawing attention, just enough to hear her say, "Some people are comfortable staying small." And someone responded with a chuckle, "Well, that makes it easier for the rest of us." And she smiled in agreement, not correcting them, not softening the implication, just letting it sit there like a fact that did not need defending. I could have stepped in then, could have shifted the tone with a single sentence, but that would have been premature. And premature moves rarely win long games, so I stayed exactly where I was, letting each word add another layer to the version of reality they were building, because the more complete that version felt, the harder it would break when it finally met the truth. I checked my watch. Not out of impatience but out of precision. Because moments like this are not about emotion, they are about alignment, about waiting until every piece is exactly where it needs to be before making a move that cannot be undone. And as the second hand swept forward, I felt that alignment settling into place, quiet, inevitable, like the final click of a lock turning. Olivia stepped closer to the man she had been speaking with, her hand briefly resting on his arm as she laughed again, and I saw the way he leaned in, the way he mistook proximity for permission, confidence for invitation, and I almost felt sorry for him, not because he was doing anything unusual, but because he had no idea what he was stepping into, no idea that the version of the story he believed was missing the only part that actually mattered. I picked up my glass again, letting the weight of it ground me, and for a moment, everything slowed, the music, the movement, the conversations blending into a single hum, and I thought about how easy it is to underestimate someone when they stop correcting you, how quickly silence gets mistaken for weakness, and how dangerous that mistake becomes when it is shared by an entire room. The man in the navy suit adjusted his cuff and began moving in my direction, not directly, not obviously, but with the kind of calculated path that looks accidental to anyone who is not paying attention, and I knew what came next, not in detail, but in certainty, because this was the point where observation ended and consequence began, and as he drew closer, I set my glass down once more, steady, deliberate, and prepared to let the version of me they had created collide with the reality they never bothered to look for. The man in the navy suit stopped just within my peripheral vision before turning fully toward me, his expression composed but carrying a subtle weight that did not belong to casual conversation, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough to avoid drawing attention but firm enough to cut through the noise around us. "Mr. Walker," he said, not a question, not a guess, but a certainty that landed differently than anything I had heard that night, and for the first time, someone in that room addressed me like I existed beyond the outline they had drawn. I met his gaze, calm, steady, and gave a slight nod, allowing the moment to breathe just long enough for its significance to register without forcing it into the open, because moments like this are not about volume, they are about precision. He extended his hand, measured, deliberate, and I shook it once, firm but not performative, the kind of handshake that carries history without needing to explain it, and I noticed the way his posture shifted slightly afterward, as if confirming something he already knew rather than discovering it, and that was the third crack, no longer small, no longer subtle, but still quiet enough to go unnoticed by everyone who was not paying attention. "We have been expecting you," he added, his tone neutral, almost routine, but the words themselves did not belong in this version of the evening, not in the narrative Olivia had built, not in the assumptions that had settled over the room like a comfortable lie, and I let a faint smile touch my expression, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because expectation implies preparation, and preparation means the next phase had already begun. I could feel a shift ripple outward, not immediate, not obvious, but present, like the first change in pressure before a storm, as a few nearby conversations faltered for half a second, eyes flickering in our direction before quickly returning to safer topics, and I knew then that the alignment I had been waiting for was no longer theoretical, it was active. Olivia was still across the room, still laughing, still moving through conversations with the same controlled confidence, unaware that the foundation beneath her had just adjusted by an inch, and that inch was all it would take. "Everything is in place," the man continued quietly, his words precise, stripped of anything unnecessary, and I nodded once more, because there was no need for elaboration, not here, not now, not in front of an audience that had not yet realized it was part of something larger than itself. I glanced past him briefly, letting my eyes move across the room not as a participant, but as an observer cataloging details, positions, reactions, and I saw it clearly then, the invisible lines connecting people, influence, decisions made long before this night, all converging into a single point that most of them did not even know existed. "Timing?" I asked, my voice even, controlled, the first full sentence I had spoken that carried weight, and he responded without hesitation. "Minutes." A single word that settled into place with absolute certainty, and I felt something steady lock into position inside me, not excitement, not anger, but clarity, the kind that only comes when every variable has been accounted for. I remembered the first time Olivia told me I was too quiet, too reserved, that I needed to be more visible if I wanted to be taken seriously, and I had almost laughed then, not because she was wrong in her world, but because visibility is only valuable when it serves a purpose, and tonight, purpose did not require noise, it required patience. The man gave a slight nod and stepped back, blending seamlessly into the flow of the room as if nothing had happened, as if no line had just been crossed, and that was the final confirmation. The last signal before execution, and I remained exactly where I was, not moving toward the center, not announcing anything, because the truth does not need to chase attention, it simply replaces it when the time comes. Across the room, Olivia turned slightly, her eyes scanning the space for a moment before landing near me, not on me, just near, as if checking that I was still where she had placed me, still following her instruction to remain unseen. And I held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer than usual before letting it pass, because she was not ready to understand what she was looking at, not yet. The music shifted subtly, the tempo changing just enough to alter the rhythm of the room, and I checked my watch again, the second hand aligning with the word I had just been given, minutes, and in that quiet space between 1 second and the next, I realized something that would have sounded simple to anyone else but carried a different weight for me. Invisibility is not the absence of presence. It is the control of it, and control, when used correctly, does not announce itself. It arrives, and as the room continued to move, unaware, I prepared to let it arrive all at once. There is a point in every controlled situation where the past stops being memory and starts becoming leverage, and as I stood there with the rhythm of the room continuing like nothing had shifted, my mind moved backward not out of nostalgia, but out of precision, tracing the exact moments that led here, the quiet decisions no one noticed because they were never meant to be seen. I remember the first contract I signed for Atlas Dynamics 15 years ago. Sitting in a small office that smelled like fresh paint and cheap coffee, when the company was nothing more than an idea. With a handful of engineers and a risk no one else wanted to take, and I put everything into it, not for recognition, not for a title, but because I understood something most people ignore, that ownership is not about what your name is attached to, it is about what your absence would break. Olivia met me 2 years after that, back when the company was still finding its footing. Back when success was measured in survival instead of headlines, and she saw the long hours, the late nights, the way I carried responsibility without talking about it, and at the time, she respected it, maybe even admired it, because it represented stability, direction, something real. But as the company grew, as the offices got larger and the meetings moved from folding tables to glass boardrooms, something else grew with it, something quieter, less visible, expectations, perception, image. And Olivia adapted to that world faster than I did, or maybe she just cared about it more. I chose a different path. One that did not require me to be in every room, to speak at every meeting, to attach my name to every decision, because I had already built the structure that allowed me to step back, a layered system of ownership, trusts, and silent positions that protected both the company and the direction I had set, and to most people, that looked like absence, like stepping away, like giving up control, but in reality, it was the opposite. It was control without exposure, influence without noise. I remember the day Olivia asked me why I was not pushing for a visible leadership role, why I was letting others take credit for what I had built, and I told her something simple, something she did not fully understand at the time. The person who signs the final paper does not need to be the one in the photo. And she smiled like it was humility, like it was a lack of ambition, and maybe part of her believed that, because over time, her questions changed again, not about why I was stepping back, but about what I was actually doing, what I contributed, whether I was still relevant in a world that rewarded visibility more than substance. The first time she introduced me at an event as someone who prefers to stay out of the spotlight, I did not correct her, because technically it was true, but truth without context is just another form of misdirection. And I had no reason to clarify something that worked in my favor. The structure I'd built was not something you could see from a title or a business card. It was embedded in agreements, in equity distribution, in clauses that only mattered when they needed to. And most people never read far enough to understand that kind of structure. They stop at what is visible, what is easy to categorize, and Olivia became one of those people without realizing it, slowly shifting from someone who knew the foundation to someone who only saw the surface. Back in the present, I could feel that entire history sitting just beneath the moment, not heavy, not emotional, but precise, like a blueprint waiting to be unfolded, and I understood why tonight mattered. Not because of what was being said, not because of the way I was being treated, but because this was the first time every assumption had aligned perfectly, every misunderstanding fully formed, and that made the correction inevitable. The music continued, the conversations flowed, and no one in that room knew that the quiet man standing near the edge had once signed documents that defined their positions, that the structure they relied on had been shaped long before they ever walked into it. And I did not need them to know yet, because awareness is most powerful when it arrives. All at once, not gradually, not in pieces, but in a single moment that cannot be ignored. I adjusted my sleeve again, a small, controlled movement, and let my gaze settle forward, not searching, not reacting. Just present, because everything that needed to be set in motion already had been, And all that remained now was the moment when the invisible framework I had built would become impossible to overlook. Olivia did not notice the shift at first because people like her rarely do, not when the change is subtle, not when it does not interrupt the version of reality they are comfortable with, and she continued moving through the room with the same controlled confidence, the same effortless smile, unaware that the ground beneath her had already begun to rearrange itself in ways she could not see. I watched her from where I stood. Not with resentment, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes when emotion is no longer part of the equation, and I realized something that had been building quietly for years, that her perception of me had not changed overnight. It had been eroded piece by piece, shaped by small assumptions, reinforced by the way others treated me, until eventually it became something she no longer questioned. I remembered the conversations that stopped happening, the moments when she no longer asked what I thought before making decisions, the way she started filling in answers on her own as if my input had become optional, and at first I let it pass because relationships shift, priorities change, but then it became something else, something more deliberate, a pattern of exclusion that disguised itself as independence. The first time she attended a major company event without mentioning it to me, she said it was last minute, not worth interrupting my schedule. And I accepted that, not because I believed it completely, but because I was already beginning to see the direction things were moving, and sometimes understanding the direction is more important than correcting the step. Over time, those events became routine, her explanations shorter, less detailed, until eventually they stopped altogether, and I stopped asking, not out of disinterest, but because asking would have changed the pattern, and I needed the pattern to continue, uninterrupted, unchallenged. Across the room, I could hear her voice again, slightly elevated now as she spoke to a group that had grown around her, her words confident, polished, the kind of language that fits perfectly in corporate environments where perception often matters more than substance. And someone asked her a question about leadership, about what it takes to succeed at her level, and she answered without hesitation. "You have to know who adds value and who does not." And there was a brief pause before a few people nodded in agreement, absorbing the statement as if it were insight rather than assumption. I did not react, not externally, because statements like that only carry weight when they are believed, and belief is most vulnerable when it goes unchallenged, when it is allowed to exist without resistance until it becomes absolute. The man in the navy suit had repositioned himself near the edge of the group, not participating, just observing, and I recognized the deliberate distance. The way he was waiting for the right moment rather than forcing one, and that confirmed what I already knew, that everything unfolding now was part of a sequence that had been set long before tonight. I checked my watch again, not out of habit, but out of alignment, and the timing was exact, every second falling into place with a level of precision that left no room for doubt, and I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper, not anticipation, not tension, just certainty. Olivia turned slightly, her eyes scanning the room once more, and this time they landed on me directly, not by accident, not in passing, but with intention, and for a moment, there was something different in her expression, not recognition, not understanding, but a flicker of something that had not been there before, uncertainty, small, almost invisible, but real. She held that look for a fraction longer than usual before her expression reset, the polished confidence returning as she turned back to her conversation, dismissing the feeling before it could take shape, and I knew then that the first real fracture had formed, not in the room, not in the company, but in her perception. I remained exactly where I was, not stepping forward, not correcting anything, because correction was not the goal, revelation was, and revelation does not happen gradually, it happens when the difference between what is believed and what is true becomes impossible to ignore. The music softened slightly as someone near the front of the room tapped a glass, a subtle signal that attention was about to shift, and conversations began to taper off, not abruptly, but in waves, as people turned toward the center, expecting something routine, a speech, an announcement. Another controlled piece of the evening that would reinforce the structure they believed they understood. I took a slow breath, steady, controlled, and adjusted my posture just enough to prepare for movement without drawing attention, because the next step was not about entering the spotlight, It was about allowing the spotlight to find me, and as the room settled into anticipation, I knew the moment that had been building quietly beneath every assumption, every dismissal, every overlooked detail was no longer waiting, it was here. The soft chime of glass against glass drew the room inward, conversations tapering into a polite hush as a senior executive stepped toward the center, his posture confident, his smile practiced, the kind of presence that usually controls a room without effort, and for a moment, everything followed the script people expected, attention shifting, bodies angling toward the front. Anticipation settling into place like a well-rehearsed routine. I remained where I was, still at the edge, still. Exactly where Olivia had placed me. But something had already changed, not visibly, not in a way most people could identify, but in the subtle recalibration of attention, in the way a few eyes lingered a fraction longer than before, in the way silence now carried a different weight. "Thank you all for being here tonight," the executive began, his voice smooth, measured, echoing just enough through the room to command focus without force, and as he spoke about growth, partnerships, and the future of the company, I listened not to the words themselves, but to the structure beneath them, the assumptions they were built on, the version of reality they reinforced, and I knew exactly where that structure was about to fracture. Olivia stood closer to the front now, her posture aligned with the rhythm of the room, her expression composed, confident, as if she belonged exactly where she was, and in many ways she did, just not in the way she believed. I saw her glance briefly toward the man in the navy suit, then back to the speaker, unaware that the connection between those 2 points had already been established long before this moment. And that connection was not something she controlled. "Tonight marks a significant milestone," the executive continued, his tone shifting slightly, introducing something new into the narrative, something that had not been announced, and I felt the room lean in, subtle but collective, as curiosity replaced routine expectation. This was the pivot, the moment where the familiar script begins to diverge from what people think they understand, and I could feel it settling into place with quiet precision. The man in the navy suit stepped forward just enough to enter the edge of the spotlight, not fully, not dramatically, but with intention, and when the executive gestured toward him, introducing him as someone who would be speaking next, there was a ripple of polite interest, a few nods, a shift in posture from the crowd, and Olivia turned slightly, her attention now focused on this new variable, this unexpected addition. He took the glass from the executive, set it aside without looking down, and let his gaze move across the room slowly, deliberately, not searching, not hesitating, just observing, and when his eyes passed over me, there was no acknowledgement, no signal, because none was needed anymore. "There are moments in a company's life," he began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that cut through the room differently than the executive before him, "when visibility becomes less important than structure." And the sentence landed quietly, not dramatic, not loud, but different enough to create a slight pause in the collective understanding of the room. I saw Olivia's expression shift, just slightly, the confidence still there, but now edged with something else, something less certain, because that sentence did not align with the narrative she had been reinforcing all night. "Most people believe leadership is about being seen," he continued, taking a slow step forward, his presence expanding without effort. "But the truth is, the most critical decisions are often made by the people you do not notice." And this time, the room did not respond immediately, the silence stretching just a fraction longer, as if something beneath the surface had been touched without being fully revealed. I did not move, did not change my expression, because this was not the moment for action, this was the moment for realization, and realization needs space to take hold. Olivia's eyes moved again, scanning, searching, and when they landed on me this time, there was no dismissal, no casual glance, just a stillness, brief but unmistakable, as if something she had overlooked was beginning to come into focus, and I held that gaze without reaction, without confirmation, letting the distance between what she believed and what she was starting to sense widen just enough to become uncomfortable. The man in the navy suit paused, letting the silence settle fully now, and then he said, "Tonight, we recognize the individual who has shaped this company from the beginning, not through visibility, but through control. And the word control hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said, and in that exact moment, I knew the shift was complete, not announced, not fully understood yet, but irreversible, because once the idea enters the room, it cannot be removed, only revealed. I adjusted my stance slightly, a small movement that aligned me with the direction of the room's attention without drawing it prematurely, and as the man's gaze finally settled in one place, steady, intentional, I felt the weight of every assumption, every dismissal, every moment of invisibility converge into a single point that was no longer hidden, only waiting to be seen. The room did not react all at once, it never does, not when something real begins to surface. Instead it shifted in layers, like a quiet recalibration of attention, and I could feel it happening before most people understood why. The way conversations fully died out, the way bodies turned just slightly more toward the front, the way expectation began to stretch into something sharper, more focused, and then the man in the navy suit did not raise his voice, did not add drama. He simply lifted his hand and gestured, not broadly, not theatrically, but with precise intention, and every eye followed that motion without realizing they were doing it. I did not move immediately, not because I hesitated, but because timing is not about speed, it is about alignment, and for a fraction of a second longer, I let the space hold, let the weight of the moment settle fully before stepping forward, one step, then another, measured, controlled, not rushed, not delayed, just exactly when it needed to happen, and the sound of my shoes against the marble floor carried farther than it should have, not because it was loud, but because the room had gone completely still. I could see it then. The realization beginning to form in fragments, in glances, in subtle shifts of posture, in the way people looked from me to the man at the front and back again, trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer fit together, and that tension, that gap between assumption and truth, that was where the moment lived. Olivia did not move at first, her expression holding steady, almost as if refusing to process what she was seeing, but her eyes tracked me now, fully, directly, no longer passing over me, no longer dismissing, and there was something there that had not existed before, not understanding, not yet, but awareness, sharp and immediate, like the first crack of light under a door that had always been closed. I reached the edge of the central space and stopped, not stepping into the spotlight completely, not claiming it, just standing where it naturally met me, and the man in the navy suit gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before speaking again. "Ethan Walker," he said, clear, deliberate, and the sound of my name carried differently now, not as a question, not as a background detail, but as a statement that required acknowledgement. There was a pause, brief but absolute, the kind of silence that does not ask for permission, it demands attention, and I could feel the entire room recalibrating around that single point, the name, the presence, the contradiction of everything they had believed just minutes ago. I did not look at Olivia immediately, not because I was avoiding her, but because this was not about her yet. This was about the structure of the room itself shifting, about the hierarchy they thought they understood being quietly rewritten in real time. "Founder," the man continued, his tone unchanged, as if he were stating something routine, something obvious. "Primary stakeholder, and the controlling authority behind Atlas Dynamics." And the words did not land with noise, they landed with weight, heavy, precise, undeniable, and for a second, no one moved. No one spoke, because there is a moment when information arrives that cannot be processed immediately, when the mind needs time to catch up to what it is being told. I saw it ripple outward then, the recognition, the disbelief, the quick mental recalculations happening behind composed expressions, and the distance between who I was perceived to be and who I actually was collapsed in an instant, not gradually, not gently, but completely. Olivia's hand dropped from where it had been resting on someone's arm. A small movement, but it carried more truth than anything she had said all night, and when I finally turned my gaze toward her, I did not see confidence, not the polished version she had worn so effortlessly, but something else, something unguarded, the realization that the person she had asked to disappear had never actually left the center of anything that mattered. I held her gaze for a moment, not long, not intense, just enough for the understanding to settle between us without words. Because words at this point would have been unnecessary, even excessive. The man in the navy suit stepped back slightly, giving space without announcing it, and the room followed that shift instinctively. Attention now anchored in a different place, a different axis, one that did not require volume or performance to hold it. I adjusted my sleeve once more, the same small, controlled motion from earlier, but now it carried a different meaning, not preparation, not restraint, but completion, because the reveal had already happened, the assumption had already broken, and everything that came next would not be about proving anything, it would be about consequence, quiet, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Silence does not always arrive loudly, sometimes it settles in like pressure, subtle at first, then undeniable, and that was what filled the room now, not shock, not chaos, but a quiet recalibration that no one could avoid, because once a perception breaks, it does not repair itself, it forces everything around it to adjust. I did not raise my voice, I did not step further into the spotlight than necessary. Because authority does not need volume, it needs clarity, and clarity was already working its way through the room faster than anything I could have said. A few people shifted uncomfortably, others straightened their posture as if that alone could reposition them within the new reality, and I could see it in their eyes, the quick mental calculations, the silent questions, the attempt to trace back every interaction they had with me over the past hour, the past year, trying to understand what they had missed. Where the disconnect began. The man in the navy suit did not speak. Again, he did not need to, because the introduction had already done its job. It had moved me from the edge of the room to the center of its structure without requiring a single dramatic gesture, and now the weight of that shift was settling into place. I took a slow breath, steady, controlled, and finally spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to carry across the silence that had formed. "We should proceed," I said, simple, direct, and the words landed not as a suggestion, but as a transition, a signal that the moment of realization was over and the moment of consequence had begun. The executive who had been speaking earlier hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, adjusting his stance, and stepping slightly to the side, not out of deference, but out of instinct, because hierarchy had already shifted and everyone could feel it even if they could not fully articulate why. "Effective immediately," I continued, my tone even, measured. "There will be a restructuring of operational oversight." And I could see the reaction ripple through the room, subtle but immediate, the kind of response that comes when people recognize the language of change before they understand its full scope. I did not rush the words that followed, because speed reduces impact, and impact was not about volume, it was about precision. All executive decisions will now be reviewed under the original governance structure, I said, and a few faces tightened almost imperceptibly, because that phrase carried implications that went beyond tonight, beyond the event, reaching into agreements and authority most of them had never questioned. I let the silence breathe again before adding, "Details will be communicated formally in the morning." And that was enough, more than enough, because clarity does not require over-explanation when the structure behind it is real. Olivia had not moved, not physically, but everything about her presence had shifted. The confidence that had defined her earlier now replaced with stillness, not weakness, not collapse, but the kind of pause that comes when someone is forced to reprocess everything they thought they understood. Her eyes stayed on me, not searching anymore, not dismissing, just fixed, as if trying to reconcile the man she had positioned on the edge of the room with the one now standing at the center of it. I did not hold that gaze for long. Not out of avoidance, but because this moment was not about drawing anything out, it was about letting reality settle on its own terms. Around us, the room began to move again, slowly, carefully, conversations restarting but quieter, more measured, as if everyone was recalibrating their place within a system they now realized they did not fully understand. The man Olivia had been standing close to earlier stepped back slightly, creating space without thinking about it. A small adjustment that spoke louder than anything he could have said, and I noticed it without reacting, because these kinds of shifts do not require acknowledgement, they confirm themselves. I adjusted my sleeve once more, the same controlled motion, but now it felt different, not preparatory, not restrained, but final, like closing a chapter that had already been written long before tonight. I turned slightly, not away from the room, but through it, moving with the same measured pace I had used when stepping forward, because leaving a moment carries as much weight as entering it, and as I passed through the space that had once ignored me, I could feel the difference, not in volume, not in attention, but in recognition. The kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood, behind me. The room continued, the event resumed, but nothing about it was the same, not anymore, because once visibility shifts, once the invisible becomes undeniable, it does not return to what it was before, it becomes the new center, whether anyone is ready for it or not. I stepped out of the main ballroom and into the quieter corridor where the noise softened into a distant echo, the kind of sound that reminds you something is still happening behind you but no longer involves you, and for the first time that night, the air felt different, lighter, not because anything had been removed, but because everything had already been resolved. I did not rush, did not check my phone, did not look back immediately. Because the need to confirm a moment only exists when you are uncertain about it, and there was nothing uncertain about what had just happened. The polished marble beneath my shoes reflected the overhead lights in long, clean lines, and I followed them without thinking, a steady rhythm replacing the quiet tension that had carried me through the evening, and it occurred to me then how little had actually changed on the surface. The building was the same, the event continued. The people inside were still moving through their conversations, but the structure beneath it all had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. I reached the end of the corridor and paused near a tall glass window that overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in sharp lines of light against the dark, and for a moment, I just stood there, not reflecting, not analyzing, just present, because not every moment needs to be broken down to be understood. Behind me, I heard the door open, soft, controlled, and I did not turn immediately, not out of avoidance, but because I already knew who it was, the timing, the hesitation in the step, the silence that followed, it all aligned too precisely to be anyone else. Olivia stopped a few feet away, not close enough to invade the space, not far enough to avoid it, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the kind of silence that does not feel empty. Just full of things that no longer need to be said the way they once did. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked finally, her voice lower than it had been all night, stripped of the polished edge she carried so easily in front of others, and I turned then, slowly, meeting her gaze without intensity, without distance, just directly, because this was not a moment that required performance. "I did," I said, calm, steady, letting the words settle without pushing them further, and she frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in the process of understanding, tracing back through conversations, through moments she had overlooked, through statements she had dismissed as something smaller than they were. "You told me you preferred to stay out of the spotlight," she said, almost to herself, and I gave a small nod, not as confirmation of her interpretation, but as acknowledgement of the words themselves. "And you believed that meant I was not there?" I replied, not accusing, not correcting, just stating the difference between what was said and what was assumed, and that difference hung between us, simple, undeniable. She looked away for a second, toward the city, toward anything that was not me, and I could see it in the shift of her posture, the recalibration happening in real time, not dramatic, not immediate, but real, the kind that does not resolve itself in a single moment, but begins there. "Everything is going to change," she said quietly, and there was no fear in her voice, just recognition, the understanding that the structure she had been operating within was no longer what she thought it was. "It already has," I answered, because change is not defined by when it is announced, it is defined by when it takes effect, and tonight had only made visible what had been in place for years. Another silence settled, but this one was different, less heavy, more grounded, like something that had been unstable had finally found its position, and after a moment she nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement, the first step of many that would follow long after this night ended. I did not say anything else, did not offer explanation or reassurance, because neither would have added value to what was already clear, and instead I turned back toward the corridor, toward the exit, moving with the same measured pace I had maintained all night, because leaving matters just as much as arriving. As I reached the doors, I paused for a fraction of a second, not to look back, but to register the moment fully, the shift, the clarity, the quiet finality of it, and then I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city open in front of me. Unchanged and completely different at the same time, and I realized something simple, something that had been true long before tonight but had only just become visible to everyone else. Being unseen does not make you unimportant, it only means people have not been looking in the right place.